There is a dead-end street in the English Midlands where nothing of any particular consequence appears to happen. The houses are tidy. The gardens are maintained with the quiet diligence of people who have somewhere better to be on weekends. A recycling bin stands at the curb, forgotten since Tuesday collection. Somewhere near the far end of the close, a child's bicycle leans against a gatepost, one pedal resting in the dirt at the particular angle that suggests the rider dismounted in a hurry and didn't think about it twice. The street is called Bonneville Close. It sits in the village of Meriden, in the county of Warwickshire, about 8 miles from the center of Coventry, in a part of England that looks very much like every other part of England within a 20-mile radius. Low hills, red brick, the distant suggestion of a motorway. If you drove through it, you would not slow down. There is nothing here that asks you to, unless you know what the name means. And if you know what the name means, you cannot stand at the end of that cul-de-sac without feeling the ground shift slightly beneath you, without hearing something in the silence that the silence is working quite hard to suppress. Bonneville. The word is on a white steel post among the hedgerows and the wheelie bins, doing the ordinary administrative work of telling postmen which street they're on. But it is also the name of a salt flat in the state of Utah, where in 1956, a man named Johnny Allen rode a Triumph motorcycle to a measured mile speed that shook the American motorcycling world to its foundations. It is the name that a company, at the absolute peak of its global confidence, chose for its flagship machine, the motorcycle that would define British engineering to the world for the next 3 decades, the most photographed motorcycle of the 20th century, the one Steve McQueen rode in films and in life, the one that teenage boys in California and London and Melbourne and Tokyo pinned to their bedroom walls, not because motorcycles were fashionable, but because that particular machine was something closer to an idea than a product. The idea that speed and beauty and function could arrive together in a single object built by human hands in a red brick factory in the English countryside. That factory stood exactly here, where the close turns back on itself, where someone has planted a hanging basket outside their front door and the petunias are going brown at the edges. The assembly line ran roughly where the garden path now runs. The main gates opened onto what is now a turning circle for delivery vans. At peak production, nearly 47,000 motorcycles passed through those gates in a single year. Roughly 80% of them were bound for North America, loaded onto ships at Southampton or Liverpool, destined for showrooms in Los Angeles and Chicago, and the highways of a country that had adopted the Triumph Bonneville as something close to a national symbol of motorcycling itself, despite the fact that it was made by a few thousand people in the middle of England who had never been to America and mostly didn't need to go. All of that is gone now. The factory is gone. The gates are gone. The assembly lines, the machine tools, the particular smell of metal and oil that the workers carried home in their overalls every evening. Gone. What replaced them was concrete foundations, drainage pipes, semi-detached brick houses with double glazing and small front gardens, and a street sign bearing the name of the most celebrated motorcycle those workers ever made. Whether that is a tribute or an irony depends on your disposition and how long you've been standing at the end of the road thinking about it. The story of how Bonneville Close became Bonneville Close is, at its core, a story about the distance between building something extraordinary and keeping it alive. It is a story about the forces that dismantled one of the great manufacturing enterprises of the 20th century, and about the people who refused, for longer than anyone thought possible, to let that dismantling happen without a fight. It is a story that involves a Bavarian immigrant with a gift for choosing names, an engineer whose instincts about sound and vibration defined an era, a conglomerate that valued rationalization over craft, and a workforce that did something almost without precedent in British industrial history, something that bought the machine nearly 2 more years of life, even as the world moved on without it. To understand why that street has that name, and why the silence above it carries that particular weight, you have to go back, not just to the factory, and not just to the motorcycle. You have to go back to Coventry in the 1880s, to a young man who had arrived in England with almost nothing except a clear understanding of what ambition required, and a name he had already chosen for the company he intended to build. A name designed to cross borders. A name that would mean the same thing in every language and every market he planned to reach. He was 21 years old. He spoke excellent English. He was thinking about selling to the world before he had anything to sell. His name was Siegfried Bettmann. He was born in the city of Nuremberg in 1863, which means he grew up in a Germany that was in the process of industrializing at a pace that was reshaping the social and economic order of an entire continent. Nuremberg itself was a city with deep roots in precision manufacturing, watchmaking, instrument making, the kind of skilled craft work that requires patience and exactitude, and a willingness to pass knowledge from one generation to the next in ways that cannot be written down. Whether Bettmann absorbed any of that directly is hard to say. What is clear is that by the time he arrived in London in 1884, he understood, in the way that only certain people understand it, that the Industrial Revolution had created a particular kind of opportunity for a particular kind of man. He found work as a clerk. He learned how the trade moved. Within a few years, he had made his way to Coventry, which in the 1880s was in the early stages of becoming something remarkable, a city that was reinventing itself around the bicycle, and before long would reinvent itself again around the motor car, and would for the better part of a century be one of the great manufacturing cities of the world. Coventry in 1885 smelled of machine oil and ambition. It was exactly the right place for a man who understood both. Bettmann began with bicycles. The choice of name came first, and it tells you almost everything about how he was thinking. He did not choose an English name, a German name, or a French name. He chose a word that meant exactly the same thing in all 3 languages, and in several more besides: triumph. It was not sentiment, it was strategy. From the very beginning, before the first machine had been assembled, before the first order had been placed, Bettmann was thinking about markets beyond England, beyond Europe. He was thinking about a word that could travel without translation, a name that could appear on the side of a bicycle in a London shop window and on a crate being unloaded at a harbor in New York, and mean the same thing in both places. He was, in the most precise sense of the phrase, building a brand, decades before anyone used that word to describe what he was doing. What he built in those early years was modest. Triumph was one of dozens of Coventry bicycle manufacturers competing in a crowded market, distinguished mostly by the care it brought to the work and the deliberateness with which Bettmann pushed into export markets that his competitors were slower to pursue. The transition into powered machines came at the turn of the century. In 1902, Triumph produced its first motorized bicycle, a machine with a Belgian engine bolted into a modified bicycle frame, unremarkable by any standard that came later, but a first step down a road whose eventual destination, on a salt flat in Utah half a century later, could not have been guessed from the starting point. The company grew through the first decade of the 20th century with the particular momentum of a business that has found its market and is learning, season by season, how to serve it better. The motorized bicycle became a proper motorcycle. The Belgian engine gave way to engines designed and built in Coventry. The product improved with each iteration in the incremental, experience-driven way that manufacturing improves when the people doing the work are paying attention and their knowledge is being retained and built upon rather than lost, between one generation of workers and the next. By 1910, Triumph was producing several thousand motorcycles a year and selling them across Europe and into markets further afield. The name was doing exactly what Bettman had designed it to do, traveling without friction, arriving in new markets, already carrying the suggestion of something worth owning. Bettman himself was becoming something more than a successful manufacturer. He was becoming a Coventry institution, which in that era meant something specific and considerable. Coventry had always been a city made of arriving people, craftsmen who came from elsewhere and stayed, skills that migrated in and planted themselves and grew into trades that reshaped the place entirely. Bettman fit that pattern precisely. He had arrived from Nuremberg with almost nothing and built one of the city's significant enterprises. In 1913, he served as mayor of Coventry, an immigrant entrepreneur not yet formally naturalized but already claimed by the city in the way that cities claim men who have contributed enough and stayed long enough that the distinction between native and newcomer stops meaning very much. The city's self-understanding at that moment was large enough to accommodate him. Coventry knew what it was made of. Then the war arrived, and it changed everything, the way the First World War changed everything it touched, which was to say completely and permanently, and in ways that could not be fully understood until long afterward. Triumph motorcycles went to the Western Front as dispatch machines, carrying messages across the mud and wire of Belgium and northern France in conditions that destroyed men and equipment alike with indiscriminate thoroughness. The machines that survived that environment survived because they were well made. There was no other explanation. You could not rely on luck across 4 years of those conditions. Reliability at that level was an engineering achievement, a product of the accumulated knowledge of the people who designed and built the machine, and the Triumph Model H, the workhorse of the dispatch corps, earned a nickname in the field that no advertising budget could have purchased: the trusty Triumph. Given by the men who rode it through the worst conditions, the industrial age had yet devised for the destruction of human beings and their machinery. The name stuck because it was true. The men who came back from that war came back with a particular relationship to the motorcycle. They had trusted their lives to it. They had seen what it could do when everything around it was trying to ensure it failed. When they came home and found peacetime work and began to earn money they could spend on something other than survival, a significant number of them spent it on a Triumph. The 1920s were, in that sense, good years for the company. The reputation built in the mud of Flanders had translated into commercial momentum, and Triumph expanded its production and its export reach through the decade with the confidence of a manufacturer that knows its product has been tested in conditions that cannot be manufactured or faked. But the 30s arrived the way the 1930s arrived for nearly every manufacturing enterprise in the Western world, with the contraction of markets, the tightening of credit, the particular misery of watching demand disappear faster than costs can be reduced. The Depression did not spare Triumph. Bettman, older now and no longer the driving commercial force behind the company he had founded, watched the business struggle through years in which the careful separation of what was financially sustainable from what was not became the dominant preoccupation of every board meeting. The motorcycle and car interests that had grown together under the Triumph name began to pull apart, because running two businesses that shared a name but required different capital, different expertise, and different market strategies was proving harder to justify as margins thinned. By the mid-30s, the split was formalized. The car business went one way, the motorcycle business went another. The man who took control of the motorcycle side of the operation was named Jack Sangster, a figure whose significance to what followed is easily underestimated because he worked mostly in the background, making decisions about personnel and resources that only become visible in retrospect once you can see what those decisions produced. Sangster had connections to the Ariel Motorcycle Company and understood the trade not as an outsider managing assets, but as someone who had spent his working life in it and knew the difference between a company being run and a company being built. He saw, in Triumph's motorcycle business, something worth building, and he knew, or came to know, exactly the person to help him build it. Edward Turner arrived at Triumph in 1936. He was 32 years old. He had previously worked at Ariel, and he brought with him a set of convictions about what a motorcycle should be that were, in the context of the industry as it then existed, genuinely unusual. Turner did not think primarily in terms of specifications, top speed, horsepower, engine displacement, the measurable parameters by which motorcycles were then conventionally assessed and ranked. He thought in terms of character. He thought about what a machine felt like to ride, how it sounded, how it responded to input, the particular quality of its vibration through the handlebars and footrests, the way a rider's relationship with it developed over miles and years. He thought about motorcycles the way a musician thinks about instruments, not as mechanisms that produce a function, but as objects with a personality that either connects with the person operating them or fails to. The engine configuration he championed at Triumph, 2 cylinders set side by side in what engineers call a parallel twin, was not, in itself, a new idea. But the particular way Turner developed it, the specific dimensions and tolerances and engineering choices he made in pursuit of a character rather than a specification, produced something that behaved differently from what had come before. The parallel twin had a sound, a particular, identifiable sound that people who loved it could recognize from a distance, and that people who didn't love it couldn't quite understand why anyone would feel strongly about an engine noise. It had a vibration, not unpleasant, not mechanical in the grinding sense, but present, communicative, the feeling of something alive beneath you rather than something merely operational. It had a responsiveness to the throttle that riders described in terms more appropriate to a conversation than a mechanical interaction. None of this was entirely rational. But the most enduring things rarely are. What Turner built into those engines was not simply a set of engineering solutions to measurable problems. He built in a personality, and personalities, once established, are extraordinarily difficult to replicate and extraordinarily easy to damage by people who do not understand what they are dealing with. That lesson would take another 4 decades to arrive at its full cost. In the late 1930s, the parallel twin was simply the thing that made Triumph exceptional, the engineering soul of a company preparing, without knowing it, for the moment when the world would need it most. That moment arrived from the east, from 30,000 feet, on the night of the 14th of November, 1940. The Coventry Blitz lasted 11 hours. It began at 7 in the evening and did not end until 6 the following morning, and in those 11 hours the Luftwaffe dropped approximately 500 tons of high explosive and nearly 900 incendiary devices onto a city that had been identified, with the cold precision of industrial targeting, as one of the most significant manufacturing centers in the British war economy. The planners in Berlin understood exactly what Coventry was and what destroying it would mean. They understood it better, perhaps, than the people living there, who had spent so long inside the ordinary rhythms of production and commerce that the strategic significance of what they did every day was not something they thought about much. You do not generally spend your working hours contemplating the geopolitical importance of your job. You think about the work itself, about the person at the next station, about what is for dinner, about whether the rain will hold off on Saturday. The bombs did not make these distinctions. The medieval cathedral came down alongside the factories. Thousands of homes were destroyed alongside machine shops and assembly buildings. The city lost, in a single night, a substantial portion of the physical infrastructure that had made it what it was. The buildings, the equipment, the accumulated spatial logic of a manufacturing center that had grown organically over decades into something that functioned, on its best days, like a single enormous interconnected organism. The Triumph factory on Priory Street, the works that Bettman had built from a bicycle workshop into one of the country's significant motorcycle manufacturers, was gutted. The roof came in. The machinery that had not been destroyed was buried under rubble. What the bombs left standing was, in most cases, not worth the effort of salvaging. The company faced a choice that was really not a choice at all. You could not rebuild in Coventry while the war was still being fought and while the city was still an active target. The machinery and tooling that could be recovered needed to go somewhere that the Luftwaffe was less likely to find. The search for a new location produced, in the way that wartime necessity produces things, a solution that was practical rather than ideal, but that would, over the following 4 decades, become something far more than a temporary arrangement. A disused factory in a village 8 miles east of Coventry, in a place called Meriden, was identified as suitable. It was remote enough from the city's industrial center to reduce its attractiveness as a bombing target. It had the physical space that was needed. It had road connections that would serve well enough. It was not by any measure a grand destination. It was simply the place that was available when a place was needed, and that kind of contingency has a way of becoming, over enough time, indistinguishable from destiny. The move was made in the early part of 1941. Workers arrived in a village that had not previously had much to do with heavy manufacturing and began the process of converting a disused facility into something that could build motorcycles at the pace that wartime demand required. Triumph was, by this point, producing machines almost entirely for military use, dispatch bikes, reconnaissance support, the practical logistics of moving information and personnel across terrain that larger vehicles could not always navigate. The parallel twin that Turner had developed before the war was adapted to military requirements, stripped of the refinements that peacetime buyers had valued, and rebuilt around the core engineering principles that had made it reliable, durable, and capable of the kind of sustained use that military service demanded. The workers who made this transition were doing something that manufacturing workers in wartime do that rarely receives the recognition it deserves. They were maintaining, under conditions of dislocation and urgency and personal fear, because these were people whose city had just been bombed and whose families were living in the wreckage, the discipline and the knowledge and the craft standards that kept the product worth making. You can force people to show up. You cannot force them to care about the work. The Triumph workers in Meriden cared about the work, and the machines they built in those early wartime years were better for it, and the dispatch riders who rode them across North Africa and Italy and eventually across the roads of northwestern Europe as the Allied armies pushed east were, in some cases, alive because of it. The war ended. The military contracts concluded. And the Meriden works, which had been meant as a temporary relocation, became permanent for the simplest possible reason. Coventry had been rebuilt, but the Triumph workers were already in Meriden, already settled in the surrounding villages, already embedded in the social geography of a place that had absorbed them. The factory had been expanded during the war to handle increased production. It had developed its own character, its own internal culture, the particular way that a workplace develops personality over time as the people in it accumulate shared history and shared knowledge and shared ways of doing things that become, after enough years, simply the way things are done here and not somewhere else. Edward Turner's post-war contribution to what was built in Meriden is where the story of the machine itself becomes inseparable from the story of the place. In 1950, Turner designed the engine that would define the next 3 decades, not just of Triumph, but of the entire global motorcycle industry's understanding of what a British motorcycle was. The engine was called the Tiger 100, and then it became the basis for something larger. The specific displacement, the specific geometry, the specific set of engineering decisions Turner made in refining the parallel twin concept he had been developing since the mid-30s, produced a motorcycle that was, at the moment of its introduction, faster than nearly anything else available to a civilian rider anywhere in the world. It was not simply fast in a quantifiable sense. It was fast in the way that certain machines are fast, communicatively, thrillingly, in a way that made the person riding it feel that the speed was coming from them as much as from the engine beneath them. This distinction matters. A machine can be fast and feel mechanical, feel as though it is happening to you rather than with you. What Turner's engine did, what the Bonneville did, when it finally arrived as a named model in 1959, was make speed feel personal. It made the rider feel implicated in what the machine was doing, responsible for it, connected to it through the throttle and the handlebars, and the particular way the frame transmitted information about the road surface beneath the tires. This is an extraordinarily difficult thing to engineer. It cannot be measured on a test bench. It can only be recognized by the person riding the machine, and then only if they are paying the kind of attention that the machine demands and rewards. The name Bonneville was chosen with the same instinct that Bettman had shown in choosing the company's name 60 years earlier. It was chosen to travel. Johnny Allen's record run on the Utah Salt Flats in 1956 had put the word Bonneville into the vocabulary of performance motorcycling worldwide. The name carried the idea of absolute speed, of pushing a machine and a rider to the outer edge of what was possible on 2 wheels on a flat surface with nothing ahead of you but distance. Attaching that name to a production motorcycle was an act of extraordinary commercial confidence. Confidence that the machine being built in Meriden could carry the weight of the association without collapsing under it. That confidence was justified. The Bonneville became, within a very few years of its introduction, exactly what the name implied. The standard by which other motorcycles were judged and frequently found wanting. The machines that came out of Meriden in the early 1960s were being bought in California and shipped up into the hills above Los Angeles and ridden on roads that the people who built them had never seen. They were being raced on circuits across the United States and Europe. They were appearing in films. They were becoming. In the peculiar alchemy that occasionally transforms an engineered object into a cultural symbol, something more than the sum of their components. The moment that completed this transformation arrived in 1963, when a film called The Great Escape was released to audiences across the United States and Europe. The film was about the mass breakout of Allied prisoners of war from a German camp, loosely based on actual events, and it featured, among its considerable cast of actors and sequences, a chase scene in which Steve McQueen rode a motorcycle across a hillside in an attempt to jump a barbed wire fence into Switzerland. The motorcycle was a Triumph TR6 trophy, modified to look vaguely German for the purposes of the film. McQueen performed most of the riding himself, including portions of the chase that his stunt double had declined to attempt. The fence jump at the end of the sequence was performed by his double, Bud Ekins, who cleared a fence of approximately 65 feet from a standing start in a single, clean, implausible arc that audiences watching in the darkness of cinemas in 1963 received as an act of pure freedom condensed into about 4 seconds of screen time. The effect on Triumph's sales in the American market was not subtle. McQueen was, at that moment, the most compelling masculine presence in Hollywood cinema. Not the most conventionally handsome, not the most technically accomplished actor, but the one whose relationship with physical objects, with cars and motorcycles, and the kinetic world of speed and risk seemed most completely genuine. When McQueen rode a motorcycle on screen, it did not look like acting. It looked like a man doing something he would have been doing anyway had the cameras not happened to be present. This quality was, for Triumph, worth more than any advertising campaign the company could have devised or afforded. It placed the Bonneville at the center of a certain idea of freedom and capability and cool-headed competence under pressure that resonated with exactly the demographic Triumph needed to reach: young American men with money to spend and a self-image to project. Throughout the 1960s, the Meriden factory ran at a pace that the village surrounding it had not been built to accommodate. 3 shifts, round the clock, because demand required it, and the machines did not stop simply because the workers needed rest. Nearly 4,000 people made the journey to work in Meriden every day, on foot from the terrace streets of the surrounding villages, by bicycle, by car, pulling into a car park that, by 7 in the morning, was already half full and smelled of exhaust and the particular cold damp of English autumn mornings. They clocked in, pulled on overalls, and went to work building machines that were, in most of the rooms they eventually reached, regarded as objects of desire. The gap between the person assembling the component and the person who eventually owned the finished machine was, in those years, enormous, in geography, in culture, in economic circumstance. The Meriden worker earning his weekly wage in the Midlands and the Californian who collected the Bonneville from a Los Angeles dealership and rode it into the Santa Monica Mountains on a Sunday morning inhabited almost entirely separate worlds. What they shared was the object itself, passing between them across 6,000 miles of ocean, carrying in its engineering the accumulated knowledge of a workforce that understood, without needing to articulate it, that what they were making was something exceptional. The workforce understood this because they could feel it. There is a quality of knowledge that exists in manufacturing environments that resists documentation, knowledge that lives in the hands and the ears and the judgment of people who have done the same work, in the same way, for long enough that the standard is internalized rather than consulted. A Meriden engine builder in 1965 could tell, by the feel of components fitting together and the sound of the engine turning over on the test bench, whether what he had assembled was right. Not whether it met the specification, though it met the specification, but whether it was right in the deeper sense, whether the tolerances had been achieved not just technically, but in the way that produces a machine that will behave as it should across thousands of miles and years of use. This knowledge cannot be written into a manual. It can only be transferred from person to person, in the way that skills are transferred when the person who has them works alongside the person who is learning them, and the learning happens through proximity and repetition and correction until the standard is no longer external, but internal. The Meriden factory had been accumulating this kind of knowledge for over 20 years by the time the 1960s reached their peak. The workforce included people who had been there since the wartime move from Coventry, who had built military machines and then rebuilt the production lines for civilian ones, who carried in their working habits the particular discipline of people who had made things under pressure and knew what the consequences of insufficient care could be. Their children, in some cases, had followed them into the factory. Their knowledge had become the factory's knowledge, passed down through informal apprenticeship and the daily practice of working alongside people who had been doing it longer. The Bonneville that left Meriden in 1968 was not simply the product of a design and a set of specifications. It was the product of a community of knowledge that had been building on that floor for nearly 3 decades. All of which makes what happened next more difficult, in retrospect, to understand, or rather, easier to understand in its immediate logic, and harder to forgive in its human consequences. In 1951, Jack Sangster had sold the Triumph motorcycle business to the BSA Group, Birmingham Small Arms, which was at that point one of the largest motorcycle manufacturers in Britain and one of the largest in the world. BSA produced its own motorcycles under its own name, and it had acquired Triumph partly for the engineering talent that came with it, partly for the export markets that Triumph had developed, and partly for the simple reason that in the motorcycle industry of the 1950s, consolidation appeared to be the rational response to a competitive landscape that was changing faster than individual companies could manage alone. Sangster had built Triumph into something extraordinary. He sold it, as builders of extraordinary things sometimes do, at the moment when its value was most obvious and its future looked most certain, which is to say, at exactly the moment when the price was highest. BSA and Triumph continued to operate as largely separate entities through the 1950s and much of the 60s, with Triumph maintaining its own identity, its own engineering culture, its own brand in the American market. But the logic of conglomerate ownership is rarely fully compatible with the logic of craft manufacturing, and as the 1960s gave way to the 70s, the pressures that conglomerate logic generates, the pressure toward rationalization, toward cost reduction, toward the harmonization of production processes across different brands and different products, began to make themselves felt at Meriden in ways that the workforce recognized even when they could not yet name the full scale of what was coming. What was coming had already arrived in Japan. Honda had been exporting motorcycles to the United States since 1959, initially in small displacement machines that occupied a market segment Triumph and the other British manufacturers had not bothered to cultivate. By the mid-60s, Honda's American operation was selling an extraordinary volume of machines to a demographic that had never previously considered owning a motorcycle, people for whom the associations of the large displacement British bike, its noise and its physical demands and its cultural connotations of outlawry were precisely the barriers to entry that Honda's smaller, quieter, more manageable machines dissolved. The famous advertising line from that campaign, "You meet the nicest people on a Honda," was not addressed to the existing motorcycle market. It was addressed to everyone who had previously been outside it, and it worked with a thoroughness that transformed the American market in the space of a decade. By the early 1970s, Honda was no longer restricting itself to the smaller segment. The CB750, introduced in 1969, was a large displacement four-cylinder machine that outperformed the Bonneville on nearly every measurable metric: smoother, faster in absolute terms, more reliable across long distances, equipped with a front disc brake when the Bonneville was still running drums. The British motorcycle industry looked at the CB750 and recognized, with varying degrees of honesty depending on where you were sitting in the organizational hierarchy, that the gap it represented was not a temporary competitive disadvantage to be closed by incremental improvement. It was a structural shift, a demonstration that Japanese manufacturing had absorbed the best of what British engineering had developed over half a century, and combined it with production capabilities and capital resources and organizational methods that British manufacturers could not match on existing terms. The BSA Group's response to this structural shift was, in hindsight, almost a textbook illustration of how not to respond to an existential competitive threat. Rather than concentrating resources on the products and the manufacturing capabilities that represented genuine competitive advantage, rather than asking seriously and without defensiveness what Triumph still did better than anyone else, and how to build on that. The group's leadership in the early 1970s embarked on an ambitious program of new model development that attempted to leapfrog the Japanese manufacturers by producing something entirely different from anything either BSA or Triumph had made before. The program produced a 3-cylinder engine, which was genuinely innovative, and a range of motorcycles built around it, which were genuinely promising on paper. It also produced, with the reliable thoroughness of large organizations attempting to do several things simultaneously under financial pressure, a series of production problems and quality failures that arrived in the American market at the worst possible moment. The American dealers who had built their businesses on the reputation of British motorcycles, who had, in many cases, staked their livelihoods on the continuing excellence of the products they sold, found themselves in the early 1970s dealing with machines that were unreliable in ways the Bonneville had never been unreliable, that required warranty work that eroded margins and damaged the trust of customers who had been loyal for years. The reputation that had been built at Meriden and maintained through the diligence of the people on that floor was being spent in the American market faster than it was being replenished, and the account it was being spent from had taken 30 years to fill. A reputation of that kind, once it begins to empty, does not refill easily. Customers who experience one serious disappointment do not simply forget it when the next model arrives. They tell other people. In the highly social world of American motorcycling, where riders clustered in groups and shared information and opinions with the intensity of enthusiasts who have organized their leisure time around a common passion, bad news traveled efficiently. By 1973, the BSA group was in financial crisis. The combination of overambitious product development, production difficulties, quality problems in the American market, and the structural competitive pressure from Japanese manufacturers that no amount of restructuring was going to quickly resolve had produced losses that could not be managed from existing resources. The British government, under Edward Heath, was faced with a decision about whether to allow one of the country's most significant motorcycle manufacturers to fail, taking with it thousands of jobs in the Midlands and the last serious British presence in what had once been a British-dominated global industry, or to intervene with public money on terms that might buy enough time for the business to find its footing. The government intervened. A rescue package was assembled. BSA as a corporate entity effectively ceased to exist in its previous form, and from the wreckage a new structure was created, the Norton Villiers Triumph Group, known as NVT, which was intended to consolidate the remaining viable assets of the British motorcycle industry into a single entity capable of surviving in the new competitive landscape. The man put in charge of making NVT work was a businessman named Dennis Poor, who had made his reputation in industrial restructuring and who approached the challenge of the motorcycle industry with the detachment and the unsentimental logic of a person whose professional skill consists of identifying which parts of a failing enterprise are worth saving and arranging for the rest to be disposed of efficiently. Poor was not a motorcycle man. He did not have a particular feeling for the product, for the culture of the factories, for the communities that had built themselves around those factories, or for the accumulated craft knowledge that represented, in the most precise economic sense, the core productive asset of the business he was restructuring. This was not, in itself, a disqualification. You do not need to love a product to manage the business that makes it. But it meant that his analysis of the situation was conducted in terms that systematically undervalued certain things that would have been visible to someone with different priorities. What Poor saw when he looked at NVT was a collection of manufacturing sites, some more productive than others, some newer and better equipped, some carrying the accumulated inefficiencies and physical limitations of facilities that had been built decades earlier for different production methods and never fully modernized. He saw a workforce spread across multiple locations, some of which could be consolidated without significant loss of production capacity. He saw a product range that needed simplification and focus. He saw, above all, a business that was spending more than it was earning, and that would continue to do so unless the cost base was reduced substantially and quickly. His analysis was, in these terms, accurate. The prescription that followed from it was, in these terms, rational. The Meriden factory, he concluded, was not the future of British motorcycle manufacturing. It was a facility that had served its purpose, that was not the most modern or the most efficient in the NVT portfolio, and that could be closed without irreplaceable loss to the enterprise. What he had not adequately calculated, what perhaps it was structurally very difficult for a person in his position to calculate, was the particular quality of what existed at Meriden, not the buildings and not the machines, and not the production capacity measured in units per shift. Those things could be approximately replicated elsewhere, given sufficient time and investment. What could not be replicated was the knowledge, the 30 years of accumulated craft understanding that lived not in any manual or specification or engineering drawing, but in the hands and the judgment and the professional identity of the people who had been building the Bonneville on that floor since before many of them could remember anything else. That knowledge was Meriden's real product. The motorcycle was what the knowledge produced, and when Poor looked at Meriden, he saw a factory. He did not see, or chose not to see, that the factory was the least important thing about it. The announcement came in September of 1973. NVT would be closing the Meriden factory. Production would be consolidated at other sites. The Bonneville would continue to be made, or something called the Bonneville would continue to be made, but it would be made somewhere else, by people who had not spent their working lives building it, and it would be made differently, and it would inevitably, whatever the specifications said, be a different thing. The Meriden workforce heard this and understood it with the precision of people who know exactly what they are being told. They were not being made redundant in the ordinary sense of the word, the sense in which a business loses a contract or reduces production and finds it has more workers than it needs. They were being erased. The factory, the community, the knowledge, the particular human organization that had built the most famous motorcycle in the world, all of it was to be terminated, tidied away, the site cleared for whatever use presented itself next. Their response was immediate and, in the context of British industrial relations in 1973, which had seen strikes and disputes and confrontations of various kinds across the manufacturing sector, most of them following patterns that management and unions had rehearsed enough times to know by heart, genuinely unprecedented. They did not strike. Striking would have meant withdrawing labor and going home, which would have achieved nothing except a temporarily empty factory and a reason for the closure decision to be accelerated. Instead, they occupied the factory. They sat down inside it, around the machines, at the assembly stations, on the factory floor that had been their working world for years, and they refused to leave. They blockaded the gates with vehicles and materials and the physical weight of their collective presence. They stopped the company from removing the tooling and equipment that, once removed, would have made the factory impossible to restart. And they did this not for a week or a month, but for nearly 2 years. The occupation of the Meriden factory was the longest and most sustained factory occupation in British industrial history. It was organized with a discipline and a coherence that reflected the particular character of a workforce that had spent decades building precision machines and understood, at the deepest level, the relationship between careful preparation and reliable outcome. The workers established rosters for the occupation, ensuring that the factory was continuously manned and the gates continuously blocked. They maintained the equipment in working order. They kept the site clean and functional. They demonstrated, by the manner in which they conducted their occupation, exactly the qualities that made the case for keeping them employed: the professionalism, the commitment, the capability, while simultaneously making the political and economic argument that those qualities deserved something better than a closure notice and a redundancy payment. The occupation attracted attention of a kind that industrial disputes in Britain did not always generate. There was something about the specific combination of elements: the factory, the product, the workforce, the motorcycle itself, that made the Meriden story resistant to the usual rhetorical framings of labor relations. It was difficult to reduce to a simple narrative of workers versus management, or unions versus capital, or the left versus the right, because the thing being defended did not fit neatly into any of those categories. The Bonneville was not an abstract commodity. It was a specific object with a specific reputation, built by specific people who had specific and demonstrable expertise, and the argument being made at those blockaded gates was not primarily ideological, it was practical. These people knew how to build this machine. They had spent their working lives learning how to do it and doing it. The knowledge was here, in this place, in these hands. Closing the factory would not transfer the knowledge somewhere else, it would destroy it. This argument reached people who might not otherwise have engaged with an industrial dispute in the English Midlands: motorcycle enthusiasts across Britain and America and Europe, people who owned Bonnevilles and rode them and understood what was being said when the workers talked about what the machine required and what its production demanded, followed the occupation with the particular intensity of people who have a personal stake in the outcome. Journalists wrote about it. Politicians took positions. The Labour Party, which came to power in the general election of February 1974, called with timing that transformed the political landscape around the Meriden dispute at almost exactly the moment it needed transforming, had commitments to the manufacturing sector and to workers' cooperatives that placed it, at least in theory, on the side of the people at the gates. The new government's industry secretary was Tony Benn, a figure whose relationship with industrial democracy and workers' control went beyond the conventional labor attachment to trade union rights into something more ambitious and more philosophically developed. Benn believed, and said publicly and repeatedly that he believed, that the people who did skilled manufacturing work had both the right and the capability to control the enterprises in which they worked, and that the conventional separation between labor and ownership was neither economically necessary nor democratically justifiable. The Meriden occupation gave him an opportunity to test this belief in practice, and he took it with an enthusiasm that alarmed some of his colleagues and heartened the people at the gates in equal measure. What Benn proposed, and what the government eventually supported, was the transformation of the Meriden factory into a workers' cooperative. The workforce would become the owners. They would collectively control the factory, make the production decisions, manage the finances, and share in the results. The government would provide a loan to capitalize the venture, a sum of nearly £5 million, which in 1975 represented a substantial commitment of public money to an experiment in industrial organization that had very few precedents at that scale in British manufacturing history. The existing NVT management, predictably, regarded the proposal with a mixture of hostility and contempt. Poor's view was that the Meriden workforce was being encouraged to take on a commitment that would consume their redundancy money, their savings, their energy, and ultimately their livelihoods in the service of an ideological experiment that the economics of the motorcycle industry simply would not support. He was not entirely wrong, but he was not entirely right either. And the distinction between those two positions is where the real complexity of what happened next resides. The Meriden cooperative began production in the summer of 1975. The workers who had occupied the factory for nearly 2 years clocked back in, pulled on their overalls, and went to work building Bonnevilles as worker owners, a phrase that sounds clean and simple in the abstract and reveals its complications almost immediately in practice. Running a cooperative is not the same as running a factory. The skills required to maintain production quality, to manage a workforce, to ensure that components arrive when needed, and that finished machines leave on schedule. Those skills existed at Meriden in abundance. The skills required to negotiate bank loans, to manage cash flow, to price products correctly in a competitive market, to make the financial decisions that determine whether a business survives the gap between the money it spends today and the money it receives next month. Those skills were present in a different way and to a different degree. The cooperative's first years were characterized by the particular mixture of genuine achievement and structural difficulty that attends most ambitious experiments in doing things differently. The achievement was real and measurable. The Bonneville that came out of Meriden in 1976 and 1977 was, by the assessment of the people who wrote it and the journalists who tested it, an exceptional machine. The quality was there. The character was there. The parallel twin that Turner had designed decades earlier still produced, in the hands of the people who had built it longest, exactly the sound and the responsiveness and the particular communicative quality that had made it irreplaceable in the affections of its writers. Whatever organizational difficulties the cooperative was navigating, they were not being allowed to compromise what happened on the factory floor. The people building the machines had not become worker owners in order to build worse machines. They had become worker owners precisely because they refused to let the machines become worse. But the structural difficulties were real, and they were compounding. The cooperative had inherited not just the factory and the tooling and the accumulated knowledge of its workforce, but also a product that was, by the late 1970s, carrying its age in ways that incremental development could not indefinitely disguise. The Bonneville of 1977 was recognizably descended from the Bonneville of 1959, and this was partly what its loyal owners loved about it, the continuity, the sense that the machine had an identity that persisted through variations, but it was also a commercial problem that grew more pressing with every year that passed without a fundamental engineering renewal. The Japanese manufacturers were not standing still. Honda and Yamaha and Kawasaki and Suzuki were investing in development programs of a scale and a consistency that the Meriden cooperative, fighting to keep the lights on and the wages paid, simply could not match. The cooperative's management, and it had developed a management structure, whatever the theoretical equality of ownership, understood this problem and attempted to address it within the constraints available to them. There were discussions about new engine designs. There were attempts to modernize certain components and systems that were most obviously showing their age. There were collaborations considered and partially pursued with other manufacturers. None of these initiatives resolved the fundamental issue, which was that a cooperative operating on a loan from a government that was itself under continuous fiscal pressure, selling motorcycles in a market where the competition was backed by the capital resources of the largest industrial corporations in Japan, was not going to be able to fund the kind of comprehensive product renewal that the situation required. The money was not there. It was not going to be there. And everyone in the cooperative knew it, which is perhaps the most difficult thing about the cooperative's later years, the knowledge, present and suppressed and occasionally breaking through into conversation. That the arithmetic was not working and was not going to work. The government loan had come with conditions and with political contexts that shifted as the political landscape shifted. Tony Benn was not industry secretary indefinitely. The Labour government of which he had been a member lost the general election of May 1979, and the Conservative government that replaced it under Margaret Thatcher brought to industrial policy a set of convictions that were, to put it with maximum accuracy, not oriented toward the continued public subsidy of workers' cooperatives in the Midlands. The new government's view of manufacturing enterprises that required ongoing government support to survive was clear, consistent, and applied with a thoroughness that left no meaningful room for the argument that certain industries or certain factories or certain communities of knowledge deserved special consideration. The market would decide. And the market, by 1979, had been making its views about the Meriden cooperative known with increasing clarity for several years. The workforce continued to build Bonnevilles through the early 1980s with a commitment that, given the financial circumstances in which they were doing it, has no adequate parallel in the ordinary language of employment and professional obligation. These were people who knew that the cooperative was struggling. They knew that the orders were not coming in at the rate required. They knew that the banks were asking questions to which the answers were becoming more difficult to provide with confidence. They built the machines anyway, with the same standards, the same care, the same refusal to let the difficulty of their situation express itself in the quality of what left the factory gates. It was, in the most precise sense, a form of integrity, the insistence that the work be done properly, regardless of what was happening around it, that the Bonneville deserved to be built as it had always been built, even as the context in which it was being built was contracting around them. The end came in the summer of 1983, not with a dramatic announcement, not with a march or a public gathering or any of the ceremonial forms that significant endings sometimes receive. It came the way financial endings usually come, incrementally, then suddenly, with a final meeting at which the numbers were laid out, and the conclusion was the only conclusion the numbers permitted. The receivers were appointed. The cooperative was wound up. The workers who had occupied those gates in 1973, who had become owners in 1975, who had built Bonnevilles through the recession years of the early 80s with a stubbornness that was indistinguishable from love, those workers were told that it was over. They collected what they were owed, which was not much. They cleared their lockers. They walked out through the gates for the last time, and the gates closed behind them. The knowledge they carried walked out with them and did not reassemble anywhere. That is the part of the story that balance sheets cannot record and that closure notices cannot adequately describe. The man who knew, by the feel of components settling together, whether an engine had been built to last, he went home to a village in Warwickshire and eventually retired, and the knowledge retired with him. The woman who could hear, from across the factory floor, when something in the production process was not quite right, she found other work, and the knowledge found no further use. 30 years of accumulated craft understanding pass between generations in the way that such knowledge is passed, through proximity and practice and the daily correction of small errors until the standard becomes instinct. All of it dispersed into the Midlands air in the autumn of 1983 and did not return. The factory stood empty for a year. Then the decision was made to clear it entirely. The demolition was completed in 1984 with the quiet efficiency that demolition crews bring to the work of erasing what took decades to build, a thoroughness that leaves nothing to photograph, no dramatic silhouette against a winter sky, no preserved shell that carries its history in visible form. The site was leveled, the ground prepared, and within a short time, the houses went up. Ordinary semi-detached brick, small gardens front and back, driveways, fences, the unremarkable domestic architecture of 1980s England spreading across the footprint of what had been, at its peak, one of the most productive and most culturally significant manufacturing sites in the country. Families moved in. Children were born who would grow up on streets that ran across what had once been an assembly line, with no particular reason to know it and no monument to tell them. The estate was given the name that was already in the local vocabulary, the name that was most obvious, and perhaps, in some quietly sardonic register, most fitting: Bonneville Close, the most famous motorcycle Meriden ever made, reduced to a postal address. An icon of 20th century engineering and culture, functioning as wayfinding for a housing estate. Whether the naming was tribute or erasure depends again on your disposition and how long you have been standing there thinking about it. Both things are true simultaneously, which is perhaps appropriate for a story in which almost every element carries more than one meaning. The Triumph name continued. A businessman named John Bloor acquired the rights to it in 1983 and spent nearly a decade building, in Hinckley, in Leicestershire, a completely new company with completely new machinery and completely new engineering. The motorcycles that came out of Hinckley from the early 1990s onward were good motorcycles, genuinely, measurably good, competitive in the global market, capable of carrying the name without embarrassment. They carried something of the heritage. They carried the name that Bettman had chosen to travel. They did not carry the knowledge from Meriden, because that knowledge was gone and could not be transferred, only approximated by people who had not grown up with it and could not grow up with it because the place in which it grew no longer existed. Stand at the end of Bonneville Close on a still weekday morning and listen. Birdsong. A car starting somewhere beyond the hedgerows. The distant sound of the motorway. The hanging basket needs watering. The wheelie bin was left out a day too late. Somewhere in a garage in California or in a lockup in the English Midlands, there is almost certainly a Triumph Bonneville, chrome perhaps dulled, perhaps lovingly maintained, an engine that, when someone who knows what they are doing brings it to life, still sounds exactly like itself, still produces the particular sound and vibration and responsiveness that Turner designed into it, and that the Meriden workers built into it across 30 years of accumulated knowledge. The machine outlasted the factory. The name outlasted everything. The knowledge is gone, and the silence above the close is the sound of something that was irreplaceable being replaced by nothing in particular, tidied away, made ordinary, given a street sign and left to the hedges and the bins and the quiet, absolute English forgetting of extraordinary things.